All right, welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here because we're about to look at history through a completely different, honestly, kind of unexpected lens. If you're a focused learner, maybe trying to sharpen your own management skills, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're diving into this fascinating idea that the foundational events of early America, they perfectly mirror the exact same challenges you face when running a modern startup or managing a growing team.
I mean, think about it this way. Back in its infancy, the United States was not the global powerhouse it is today. Not even close. It was literally the ultimate, incredibly fragile startup. You had a super risky venture built on this radical new idea, operating on a tiny shoestring budget and facing off against massive, aggressive competitors. But against all odds, this fragile little business matured into a massive enterprise. And the really cool thing is, the leaders who built it left behind a management playbook, real, valuable standard operating procedures that we can absolutely apply to our own professional lives right now. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to crack open the historical vault and run through 5 core modules of executive leadership: building the executive team, managing leadership transitions, scaling the enterprise, navigating existential crises, and finally, setting boundaries and mediating. Okay, let's jump right in. Module 1, building the executive team. We are starting with George Washington's startup phase. Picture this. It's April 1789, and George Washington steps onto a balcony in New York City. He wasn't a king, even though, honestly, a lot of people wanted him to be. He was our very first CEO, and he was stepping into a role that had zero script. Historian Dr. Eliza Vance makes this great point. She notes his biggest hurdle wasn't actually winning the war, it was defining the peace. Since he was the first guy in the chair, every single move he made, literally down to how he dressed or how he signed his name, set the company's foundational standard operating procedures. He was entirely building the airplane while flying it. Now, Washington brilliantly realized right out of the gate that he could not scale this operation alone. The job was just way too big. So he executes step 2. He delegates. He builds the very first C-suite, which we know as the cabinet. But, well, hiring brilliant advisors brings its own massive headaches, right? Step 3 immediately meant managing some legendary workplace rivalries, especially the intense clashing between 2 of his top executives, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Beyond just assembling the team, Washington had to actually prove this brand new management structure worked in practice. And he did. He proved the federal government could enforce its own company policies during the Whiskey Rebellion, literally leading troops himself to suppress it. But you know what his absolute ultimate leadership flex was? Executing a voluntary exit strategy. Giving up power after 2 terms was this massive act of revolutionary defiance. It proved the company outlasts the founder and that the office is always, always greater than the man. Moving right along to Module 2, managing leadership transitions. Let's look at the first CEO handoff. So, the startup honeymoon phase? Totally over. By the 1790s, the organization is actively fracturing into 2 warring factions. Talk about a toxic internal workplace culture. Just listen to this quote from John Adams, the guy who took over. He says, "My vice president is my greatest political rival. My cabinet is loyal to Hamilton. I am alone in my own administration." Wow. Adams inherited a complete nightmare. An external quasi-war with France, an internal fracturing so severe it led to the highly controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. But here's the absolute game changer: how Adams handled his exit strategy amidst all that incredible hostility. In 1800, he faced a really bitter, painful election loss. But his response? He decided to just leave quietly in the middle of the night. Despite all the intense rivalries and bruised egos, stepping aside allowed for the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing factions in modern history. He set the gold standard for a graceful succession plan. All right, Module 3, scaling the enterprise. We're talking Thomas Jefferson and his aggressive growth strategy. When Thomas Jefferson took the CEO job, he had this super specific vision of an empire of liberty driven by independent farmers. But, and here's the irony, to actually pull that off, he had to execute a massive expansion of centralized power. Just look at this number, $15 million. Back in the early 1800s, that was an absolutely mind-boggling budget approval request. But with the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson literally doubled the size of the entire operation overnight with this single stroke of a pen. Biographer Dr. Marcus Thorne actually points out that Jefferson was a man of deep contradictions. On one hand, he's preaching limited government. On the other, he takes this massive, frankly questionable constitutional gamble to make a wild acquisition that forever changed the map of the world. And honestly, like any good leader scaling a business, he didn't just buy the new assets blindly.
He audited them. He sent out the Lewis and Clark expedition to map it all out and see exactly what the company just bought. Which brings us to Module 4, Navigating Existential Crises. Let's dig into James Madison's disaster management. Look, sometimes, no matter how flawlessly you plan, external forces will push your organization right to the absolute brink. Madison takes the helm in 1809, and immediately competitors, in this case the British, are aggressively harassing their shipping lines. By 1812, things escalate rapidly, pushing the young nation to its breaking point in the War of 1812. And then, the literal worst-case scenario happens. The enemy breaches the perimeter and burns headquarters down. The White House is up in flames. When you are in the dead center of a corporate disaster and morale has totally flatlined, finding and protecting symbols of resilience becomes absolutely critical. While the president was out in the field trying to manage the war, First Lady Dolly Madison stepped up in a huge way. With the flames literally approaching, she made the split-second decision to save the iconic portrait of George Washington. That wasn't just about saving a piece of canvas. It was about keeping the culture and the very spirit of the organization alive when everything else was turning to ash. And finally, Module 5, Setting Boundaries and Mediating. Enter James Monroe and an era of corporate maturity. Managing an established, maturing enterprise means you're constantly playing a dual game, setting firm external boundaries while frantically mediating internal disputes. On the surface, Monroe's era looked pretty united, but deep internal HR tensions were brewing fast. Externally, he laid down the law with the Monroe Doctrine, basically a giant keep-out sign to European competitors. But internally, he was desperately trying to mediate massive fundamental fractures. The Missouri Compromise was his internal mediation, a super fragile temporary bandage on the gaping wound of slavery, which, as we know, was sowing the seeds for a much larger crisis down the line. When we step back and look at these leaders, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, we really have to see the humans behind the titles. They were brilliant, absolutely, but they were also deeply, deeply flawed. And as we wrap up this explainer, I think it's so clear that they weren't just managing an existing organization, they invented the foundation of it completely from scratch. And that really captures the true value of their legacy. Dr. Eliza Vance sums it up perfectly. She says, "They left behind a blueprint. It wasn't perfect, but it was designed to be improved." You see, this early playbook was never supposed to be set in stone. It was always meant to be iterated on, adapted, and improved by the future managers, citizens, and leaders who came after them. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. They left us the blueprint. Whether you are currently trying to manage a totally unexpected crisis, figuring out how to aggressively scale your business, or just trying to build a cohesive C-suite from the ground up, how will you apply these historical lessons to your own leadership journey today? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this historical playbook helps you build something incredible. See you next time.